Hi, we're going to be talking today about another style of a cappella singing from South Africa. This is called Isicathamiya, and I'm framing it in the context of apartheid and sort of breaking down barriers there. So, all right. So apartheid was a period in South Africa that lasted from 1948 to 1994, and this is just going to be a very, very brief overview. It was basically designed so that South Africa could be dominated politically, socially, and economically by the nation's white minority population. So there was a couple of things that led up to it, but a few key legislative acts really kicked this off. So the first one in 1949 was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, which is just what it sounds like. You could only marry within your race. Whites could only marry whites, blacks could only marry blacks, etc. In 1950, the government decided, hey, how do we really know who is who? Let's make sure we get everybody organized here. And so everybody had to kind of come in and officially register as a particular race. And there was four categories: white, black, colored, which meant mixed race, and then Asian, well, Indian they called it, but it was sort of a catch-all, but it really kind of specifically was targeted to the British, former British India colony descendants who had come over from what was formerly British colony of India. So anyway, the categorization was made based primarily on physical appearance, skin color, obviously, hair color and texture, but also on cultural characteristics. So what you were eating, who you were associating with, where you were living, what you knew about the different cultures, things like that. Now, some people could pass as different races, and that could benefit you if you, for example, were in love with somebody from a different race and wanted to marry them. You might try to pass as a different race. And yeah, it was just a really difficult, awful thing. So then this leads into the period of forced residential segregation, where they decided they were just going to make everybody live with their races. This was awful. During this time, 3.5 million Black Africans were forcibly moved from their neighborhoods into segregated neighborhoods as a result of these apartheid legislations. It was the largest, some of the largest mass evictions in modern history. And the government then basically said that if you didn't do it, they were going to take away all sorts of rights and all sorts of things from you, which honestly, they ended up doing a lot of that anyway. But that was this big long period. And during that time, a lot of protest movements kind of sprung up. You have probably heard of Nelson Mandela, who was one of the leaders of these movements, and they were pushing back against the government. He got thrown in jail, along with a lot of other leaders. There was a lot of people who were killed during this time. And the white minority had set it up so that they were firmly in charge of a lot of things at this time. And so they managed to stay in control. All right, so we'll come back to this a little bit later. Let's move on now to talk about the vocal style. So Isicathamiya is the soft style of a cappella singing. It doesn't have a very strict literal translation, but a lot of times it's translated as tiptoe music, and that's because it was developed by these diamond mine workers in the 19th century who had traveled by train quite far from their families, and they had to be quiet when they were singing this at night when they were done with their work because they didn't want to wake up the neighbors who were already asleep. It's sung a cappella, no instruments. It is traditionally all male groups who are singing it because that's who was working in the diamond mines. And it's often accompanied by these very stylized dance movements. So there is a focus on very smooth harmonic blends as well. So it's a little bit different than the Imbubwe style of Solomon Linda. All right, so now let's talk about Ladysmith Black Mambazo. This was a group that was formed in 1960 by Joseph Shabalala, and the group was originally called Isicathamiya. Now, the group had evolved a lot over the years, but when it initially started, Joseph had started having these dreams about this choir singing in perfect harmony. And he was hearing this beautiful music in his head. And as he was hearing this music, he kind of took it back to his group and he was like, guys, I'm hearing this music. Listen to me. Here's how it's sounding. Let's try to emulate my dream music. And it was a little bit of a challenge for the other folks who were not hearing this dream music, but eventually he got the sound that he wanted. And whenever they got that sound, he started entering them in competitions and they were just doing great. They were just crushing it with these competitions. So the group was just winning almost every time. They were going to Johannesburg. They were going to another town called Durban. And it got so good that he was like, we need a different name. We need a name that kind of reflects us. So they changed the name to Ladysmith Black Mambazo. The name represents their hometown, Ladysmith, because they were traveling and they wanted people to know where they were from. Black stands for the strongest farm animal, and that is the ox in his mind. And the Mambazo means axe in Zulu, which symbolizes their competitive prowess. Okay, so in 1967, they had gotten enough attention that they were going to start recording for the radio. This was possible because even though this was during apartheid, remember, they avoided overtly political music. They were just focused on making very uplifting, beautiful music. And so they weren't banned from being on the radio. As they got more popular and more people were hearing them, they actually got a recording contract in 1972 with Gallo Records, which was the same record company that Solomon Linda got his contract with for Imbubwe. This recording contract led to their first record in 1973, which almost immediately hit gold status. This is very important because it was the first album by any Black artist or Black group to do so in South Africa. So it was very exciting. And this led to big professional success. Their subsequent albums almost all hit gold or platinum right away. They were considered professional singers, and just really their star was starting to rise. We're going to talk about a particular album that they did in collaboration with Paul Simon. But before we do that, I just want to mention that they had collaborated later with a bunch of other different artists that you probably have heard of: Emmylou Harris, Josh Groban, Dolly Parton, Sarah McLachlan, Stevie Wonder, just a bunch of really famous folks. Now, the connection to apartheid. Because they were heard on the radio and they were just rising stars really quickly as they were traveling to these competitions, a lot of people heard their music and a lot of people really loved them, regardless of race. So they were kind of an interesting exception in some ways to the very strict segregation that was happening, because people wanted to hear their music. And so white folks were saying, we really want to hear them. We want them to come to our district and sing for us. And so sometimes they were allowed to do that, to cross borders and perform. And sometimes they weren't allowed, but they did it anyway. And so that was an interesting privilege that they had, I guess, that other people didn't have. And it was because of the music that they were bringing, that was really bringing people together. One of the group members was recalling an incident where they were in the middle of a performance and they kind of had to be hidden. And so this brings us back almost to the diamond mine workers and the tiptoe guys having to sing very softly, because a lot of times during their performances, they also had to kind of sing softly in a way, because they were also in hiding sometimes, hiding from the government officials while they were doing these performances and having almost these underground performances, because they technically weren't allowed to be in these districts or these areas as they were doing that. And there was a lot of close calls. They were sneaking away. There were police coming if someone called the police, for all sorts of reasons, whether they were in an area they weren't supposed to be in, or if they were performing in a Black area, but white people were coming to the performance, which also happened. And if someone called the police, they had to scatter and get out of there. So all of that happens. And there's some articles that you can read to learn a little bit more about that. Oh, one time they were also brought before a judge, and the judge was, getting ready to kind of inflict a punishment on them, and they started singing, and the judge was like wiping his eyes, and he was like, that was so beautiful. So just all these ways that music can kind of bridge these gaps. Also, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, he made a public statement saying that it was Ladysmith Black Mambazo's music that helped him get through those dark decades when he was imprisoned, listening to their songs and hearing in it a message of peace, just because the music was so beautiful. All right. So I want to talk about this album, Graceland, which was a collaboration with Paul Simon, very famous album. You probably, well, maybe you've heard of Paul Simon, Simon and Garfunkel. Simon and Garfunkel were a big American folk rock duo, one of the best-selling groups of the 1960s. And in the early 1980s, Paul Simon had faced a lot of personal and professional issues. So he had had a failed marriage. He had had some problems with his former partner Garfunkel. Their relationship had deteriorated, and he had been trying to produce solo albums and had a really unsuccessful one. So he was just sort of looking for something new. Well, he had come up with this idea to go to South Africa after having been given a bootleg cassette that he wasn't supposed to have. He had actually got it from one of the house musicians for the Saturday Night Live band. And he heard it and he was like, oh my goodness, I just really like this music. It's so uplifting, it's so cheerful. And so I'm going to go to South Africa. Now, he wasn't supposed to go to South Africa because the United Nations had imposed a cultural boycott. At this time, the rest of the world was really paying attention to apartheid and speaking out against it, saying, this is wrong. We got to do something about this. They've been oppressing their people. This is not good. So there was trade restrictions and travel restrictions and all sorts of stuff, and including this cultural boycott. So you weren't supposed to be listening to their music or anything like that. And that's why the cassette was bootleg. Despite that, he snuck off to Johannesburg, and he believed that the collaboration would help raise awareness for apartheid, or at least that's what he said. So this was resulted in this 1986 album, Gracelands. He did some sessions in Johannesburg, and one of the groups he worked with there was Ladysmith Black Mambazo. And he also flew some musicians back to New York and London. Ladysmith Black Mambazo in particular, he flew them to London to continue working with them after he had done the Johannesburg sessions. And the first recording they did was Homeless, which you will hear. Another one they did was Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes. And actually, a song that you might know, even if you don't know the other two, because this was a big, big hit, was the song You Can Call Me Al. They are uncredited on this particular song, but it is Ladysmith that is doing the backup vocals in that song. So they actually were on Saturday Night Live. If you go on YouTube, you might be able to find it. And they got a lot of attention from that, from being on SNL. In 1987, the album won the Grammy for Album of the Year. It was Paul Simon's most successful solo album, sold over 16 million copies worldwide. The album did get some criticism for two reasons. First, for breaking the cultural boycott. Paul Simon argued it was a political statement showing collaboration between Black and white musicians. And second, because there were some claims of plagiarism that came about. It's not just a collaboration with Ladysmith Black Mambazo. There were a number of musicians that Paul Simon worked with. One band in particular, Los Lobos, was very upset with Paul Simon, claiming that he stole their music, but that's a separate issue for another time. The album is a very interesting album. It has all sorts of different genres on it, like pop, rock, the a cappella music of Isicathamiya, but also Zydeco, and some other South African styles as well. So you should definitely check it out. It's worth a listen for sure. But for now, we'll listen to some of the songs with Ladysmith Black Mambazo, and I hope you enjoyed them.